All right, welcome back. Today we're going to look at monopolies again, and this time we're going to look at them in light of public policy and why government may allow them and what governments will do to deal with the existence of monopolies. So at the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the effects of monopolies on society's welfare and describe ways that government can address the challenges that monopolies present. All this information is in your book, Chapter 14, and the page numbers are on the screen, so make sure that you read it. Just as a recap, to remind ourselves, we talked about monopoly last time, and we found that versus perfect competition, monopolists tend to produce less output. They tend to produce that output at a higher price, and as a result, monopolists tend to earn profit in the long run when they're unregulated. And so, is the existence of monopolies good or bad for society? Well, clearly, when it comes to the consumer's point of view, monopolies tend to detract from overall societal good. In fact, because they produce less at higher prices and produce profit in the long run, generally speaking, we see an inefficient market. There are beneficial trades that could occur that do not, which means that consumer surplus is lost and we create deadweight loss. All of that leads to a less than optimal outcome for the economy. If we want to, we can go ahead and take a look at the situation of a monopoly versus perfect competition graphically. We could say in perfect competition, with this overly simplistic example in which marginal costs are equal to average total costs, we could say that consumer surplus is the area in pink. So the perfectly competitive firm would produce where price is equal to marginal cost, and that would be at quantity QC. And so anything above the average total cost, marginal cost curve, but below the demand curve would be consumer surplus. That's all of these folks are willing to pay more than they had to purchase the product, and so they have a certain degree of surplus. In fact, all of the consumers have surplus up until the last unit is sold, and that person's willingness to pay is equal to the price, so their consumer surplus is zero. But that's in a perfectly competitive market. We know that for a monopolist, they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So if I look at a monopolist, I say that they're going to produce at quantity QM, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. They will charge price PM, and so we see that quantity is less, the price is higher. This area here in green is their profit, because this is the area price above average total cost. So this is their profit. This area here, because this is our quantity, this area is our consumer surplus. Folks are willing to pay a higher price than they had to in order to consume the good, and that surplus goes down till it reaches zero at the last trade, which means then that this area in yellow, which was part of our consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive market, is now lost. It's not reclaimed in the form of profit. It doesn't retain itself its nature as consumer surplus. It in fact is deadweight loss. This is all of the trades that could have happened and the benefits that they represent that don't happen as a result of us having a monopoly. So what are the overall effects of a monopoly on society? We have a loss of consumer surplus where consumers are worse off. We have an increase in producer surplus in the form of profit, so producers are better off, and deadweight loss is created, which means we have efficiency loss. So overall, particularly from a consumer's point of view, we have here a less than optimal outcome as a result of a monopoly. But then why do we allow for monopolies? Well, in one respect, the government tries to prevent monopolies from occurring because of the loss of efficiencies. And so government does go out of its way to try and break up and prevent monopolies from forming. But there are times in which the government will allow monopolies to exist, and those are natural monopolies. Natural monopolies are defined as any sort of business in which the average total cost curve is decreasing over the relevant amount of output. Basically, a natural monopoly exists when average total costs continue to drop as you produce more and more output. So there are economies of scale that exist in a natural monopoly that allows for it to make sense, so that the existence of a monopoly makes sense from a consumer's point of view. Because as a result of having economies of scale, we're able to reduce our average total costs over production. if we were to break up the natural monopoly and make multiple companies exist, then because of economies of scale, it means then that their average total costs would actually be higher separately than if they were to operate as one single company. And so we'd end up with higher prices and lost efficiency. So there are times in which if there's enough high enough fixed costs over the course of the amount that we're going to have to sell to cause average total cost to drop. If that happens, then we have a natural monopoly. There are a couple of general examples that you may be familiar with for natural monopoly, like the gas company or the electric company. It's far less expensive on an average total cost basis for there to be one electric company than there is to have multiple companies, each laying their own power grid to try and provide energy to the area. Same with the gas company. Generally speaking, the cable company, cable TV, was a natural monopoly because, again, you have to run cable to every house. And so it's just much more efficient and leads to lower average total costs for one company to lay cable and to create the infrastructure than it is to have multiple companies trying to do that on their own. So a lot of the utilities tend to fall into this idea of natural monopoly. But even though it makes sense for these types of companies to exist as a natural monopoly, it doesn't mean that government doesn't care. And in fact, there are certain responses that government may choose to pursue to try and manage the loss to society with the existence of a natural monopoly. One approach is public ownership, where the government could actually take over and run the business. Unfortunately, many economists look at that and say that doesn't really work. They're oftentimes poorly run, in large part because there's no incentive for the government to seek profit. Because they're not profit-seeking, there's no incentive for them to keep costs down, and so you end up with a organization that's not well run and certainly not as efficient as it could be. The other option is to regulate, and this tends to be how government responds. They could set a price ceiling that says, we understand that there's a monopoly, we understand the need for the existence of a monopoly, but we also understand how monopolists price their products. And so the government could step in and say that there's a certain price that you can't charge above, which would help kind of alleviate some of the loss in efficiency. And so in that regard, then, the government could use regulation and allow businesses to run and let market forces take effect so that there's a reduction in loss, that there are presumably lower costs and a more streamlined operation. So what does regulation look like graphically? Well, if we look at a natural monopoly without regulation, then we would say that the natural monopolist would produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at QM, and that they would traditionally charge a price PM for their customers. And so in an unregulated market, we know that there's going to be some consumer surplus, there's going to be profit for the monopolist, but then there's going to be all this deadweight loss, which is loss to society. As a response, government could regulate it and say, instead of allowing the monopolist to charge PM, which is what they would want to charge, they may be limited to being only able to charge a price like PR for regulated price. If the government limits it to PR, then you would see that the profit for the monopolist gets much smaller. Now it's just this little tiny rectangle just slightly above average total cost until the demand curve, and it gets much smaller. And in fact, government could choose to limit price to price P star R, which would put the price right at average total cost, which would leave the monopolist with zero economic profit. And presumably that would be kind of an ideal situation from a government perspective, because that would restore the consumer surplus, or at least most of the consumer surplus in the market, and eliminate monopolist profit and monopolist price control. If the government were to go further and lower the price below P star R, then what we would find is a situation in which now the monopolist is actually earning negative profits. And so in the short run, as long as the price is above average variable cost, the monopolist will stay in business. But in the long run, if they're not allowed to earn profit, even a monopolist will get out of the industry and leave it. So if the government regulation goes too far with their price, then price regulation, then the monopolist will leave. So the general idea that monopolists can charge whatever price they want is not really true. One, because they're not going to charge whatever price they want. They'll charge the price that goes with the appropriate quantity given marginal cost and marginal revenue. But also, if they're regulated, they won't be able to charge the price that they want. And if the price goes too low, they will in fact leave the market. And that'll pretty much do it for natural monopolies. We'll come into class tomorrow and work on some problem sets, and I will look forward to seeing you then. Bye.